I don't fit in anywhere and relationships are way too much work. Therefore, I'm satisfied to entertain myself with solitary activities, and I don't want to have anything to do with the outer world. Hello, my name is Tariana Rocha and I'm a psychoanalyst. The sentence that I've just said is a pretty good example of how the schizoid mind works. Now, when you look at the DSM-5 and the description it gives us of schizoid personality disorder, we understand it's actually a pretty superficial description. And there are some misleading things in the list of symptoms that aren't really very corroborated when it comes to the literature, the extensive literature that exists on schizoid phenomena, on schizoid personality disorder. So I want to go a little bit more into why the schizoid has given up on relationships, whether how he or she actually feels about interacting with the outer world and with people, and also give you some interesting literature for you to look into. So there's The Empty Core, which is a book by Jeffrey Seinfeld, and there's The Schizoid Phenomena, which is a book by Harry Guntrip. They're excellent references for you to know more about the schizoid personality disorder. So basically, let's understand the inner landscape of the schizoid. When you look at the DSM-5, you look at characteristics like schizoids don't really look for relationships outside their immediate family. In clinical practice, we understand that schizoids might even get married, but then they don't have relationships outside their spouse. They don't really feel that much sexual pleasure, and they don't really, in the sense that they don't look for it, which isn't 100% true, but that's another issue. But they generally don't desire to have sexual interaction with other people. They feel very little pleasure in few activities, if any activities at all. They have very flat affect. That means that you don't really get these big emotional reactions from them. Schizoid people, they don't look for relationships, and they will report that they're quite happy this way. Many schizoids will actually say, like, why do we have to be diagnosed with a personality disorder? What's wrong with being solitary? And obviously there's nothing wrong with being solitary, but there are a few points of interest for us who are students of psychoanalysis, of psychology, or who are therapists. Interesting points that we want to take into consideration when we're dealing with schizoid patients, or if you are someone who has schizoid traits, there are some interesting points about this personality structure that can help you gravitate towards further healing and a more satisfying way of living life. So what do I want to talk about now? Well, basically, I want to talk about when and why the schizoid shuts the world off. What happens is that children, if you look at theories like object relations theories, children, babies, they are born in a very narcissistic symbiotic state. What this means is that they perceive their existence by mixing up the sort of stimuli that they get internally with the stimuli that they get externally. To make this clear, imagine that a baby who is born without actually being able to see things very clearly because the baby's eyesight isn't fully developed, and without being able to understand that the baby is an individual and that there are other individuals that are apart from him. This baby will experience a number of things: light, sounds, vibration, touch, anything that their senses can pick up. And their senses can pick up things that come at them externally, but they also react to things that they feel internally. When the baby wants to fart, to go poo, to pee, to nurse on the mother's breast, to scream when the baby feels discomfort, cramps, hunger. It feels all of these sensations. But in the very beginning, symbiotic narcissistic state, the infant cannot differentiate between which stimulation is coming from inside, which is coming from the outside. The infant doesn't really understand that mom or that primary caretaker, could be a father, could be someone else, is separate from him. So the very first experience that babies have of the outer world is through what we call a subjective object. Let me explain this because it's pretty easy to understand. Think about it. If you're mixed up with all of the sensations that you feel, and when you get hungry, this big breast full of milk shows up and feeds you. And when you're dirty, this being shows up and cleans you. You might get the impression that you are actually calling the shots. You're the big boss. And this big, healthy milk-filled breast shows up? Because when you desire something, the world responds to you. And this is where the baby sees the mother, the outside object, as belonging to him or her. I control what this object does. It is an extension of me. So the object is perceived as a subjective thing, something that exists inside or as an extension of the baby. As the baby interacts with this primary caregiver, it will start to differentiate between the caregiver and itself. It will start to make sense of all of these different stimuli that it's been feeling, in the sense that it will start to understand that some stimuli is coming from the outside in and some is coming from the inside out. This is normal development phase for the baby, and it starts understanding that there are people outside of itself that have their own motives and drives and, their own wishes. So then the baby enters a phase of kind of mixing outer objects with inner objects, but already being able to understand that, people are kind of separate from him. Then he starts seeing mommy, daddy, the primary caregiver, and anybody else as a transitional object. So what's a transitional object? In this period, the baby still kind of sees the object as an extension of itself, but it understands that that's not 100% true anymore. It can differentiate a little bit more. It's a semi-symbiotic state. It already understands that the big breast full of milk doesn't come exactly when the baby calls, because it has its own wishes. It has its own agency. Now, if everything goes well, the baby will transition into the phase where it perceives objects as being objective objects. Now the baby can understand, oh, wait a second. The owner of the milk-filled breast is not attached to me at all. It's a completely different sort of object. Oh my God, it's separate from me. So that means I don't control it. And this is where a lot of things, in this trajectory, a lot of things can happen in terms of trauma that will make the baby kind of be like, wait a second, I don't want to be in this world where people are separate from me and where I don't control the big breast, the big milk-filled breast. This is quite dangerous. What if the breast doesn't come when I need it to come? Oh, I don't want to be part of the outer world. And then this is where the person who has a schizoid trauma will actually shut down and will try to go back into a symbiotic state. And how does this happen? Well, basically, all babies need their caregivers to respond to their needs through mirroring. So if I'm sad, I need for this big adult to show up and to be able to hold space for my sadness and not just be punishing me for my sadness and making me scared of this external object that pops up and punishes me when I already feel sad. When I'm hungry, the baby needs someone externally to come and provide food. The baby needs to be able to experience 100% vulnerability and dependence in a way that generates mostly positive, even though negative experiences will always be generated, and this is a healthy part of development. The baby mostly needs to understand that this external object that receives it and takes care of it will respond positively. This allows the baby to first and foremost fully experience narcissism, fully experience being the king of the world, fully experience having power. Only when the baby can fully experience having this power can it give it up and decide to become a separate person and give that parent permission to be a separate person as well. If the baby feels that this parent is hostile, negligent, doesn't show up when it needs the parent to show up, it might come to the conclusion that, wait a second, when I was in my symbiotic state, when internal and external objects were all mixed up, it felt more safe than this horrible reality where I have to admit that this external person is separate from me and that I don't control it and that I need it and that it doesn't come when I need it, when I need them to come. It hurts to not see myself mirrored in this person's eyes. It hurts to have this person be hostile or negligent or not show up. If the baby does not have an adult that will interact with it regularly in a non-judgmental, loving, responsive way, if the baby does not have an adult that is mentally and emotionally healthy enough to be able to look into the baby's eyes and to see the baby as an individual little human being, if the baby cannot see itself in the mother's or father's eyes And this might not be able to happen because mom is depressed. Mom has her issues. She's dead. She's working. She's not around. She has mental illness. The first way that we have a sense of self is when we look at our mommy's eyes, at our daddy's eyes, at our caretaker's eyes, and we see that they see something inside us. If they don't see anything inside us because they're disconnected with their, worried about their own worries, the schizoid cannot find himself or herself. And this is scary as heck. So they decide that the outer world is no place to be. Relationships are dangerous. Relationships are not trustworthy. And when we look at schizoid patients, many of them came from quite narcissistic upbringing, where their emotional needs were completely ignored. But whenever there was contact with a primary caregiver, they were very rigid and they had many rules. And so the baby actually felt ignored as an individual and as an emotional being. But every time that they were seen inside their mommy's or daddy's eyes, it was with all of these conditions and this rigidity and with all of this suffocating, all this suffocating energy, like you have to be what I want you to be. So what the baby learns is that not only is the outside world incapable of seeing it and of satisfying its needs, and that relationships are very difficult and that baby cannot have its needs met, but it also learns that if it were to have contact with other people, it would be invaded, suffocated, and it would lose its sense of self. So having had this sort of course, it might be that schizoid patients have like a temperament that, a hereditary condition that makes them not be able to bond externally so much. But we do notice that there seems to be this type of trauma when it comes to not good enough mothering or fathering that causes the baby to see external objects or to see going out into the external world and dealing with people as a very dangerous, impossible thing. So the baby, and I'm saying baby, but it could be a child, it could even be a teenager when it decides to shut down from the outer world. This person comes to the conclusion that her needs cannot be met. When they are met, she must either be suffocated by the outside person. And there's another thing that certainly does not show up in the DSM-5, which is, they say that schizoids don't want human relationships. What I'm telling you is that the literature shows that they did want it at some point. And because they couldn't have it, it hurt so much that they created a barrier against their own perception of needing it. And this is why we see schizoid patients with very little affect, because there are basically three ways that schizoid patients create this barrier so that they don't even perceive their own need for intimacy and attachment. The first way is by repressing their emotions. You'll see in the DSM-5 that they have very flat affect. And if you feel the need for connection and it hurts you so bad because you don't know how to get it, so, one way that your mind can deal with that is just by basically repressing those needs. Let's not feel them at all. Let's just not feel. And many schizoids, as a matter of fact, schizoids are notorious for not being able to understand their inner world or identify their feelings, because there is a mechanism there for them to not even to be able to feel the fact that they need other people. And so long as their affect is flat, they don't have to go into that need. Another way that schizoids deal with this vulnerable need for other people, that's a human need. It doesn't matter what personality disorder you develop. You were born with this human need, right? Another way that they deal with it is by satisfying this human need for another person, for other people, but through dissociation and fantasy. Many schizoids have a very rich inner fantasy life. Many of them have maladaptive daydreaming. If the psyche does not have another person or external elements to interact with, when it's isolated, instead of building an even stronger sense of identity and self because it's not getting mixed up with outer elements, the psyche will actually disintegrate, or it might go back into symbiotic states. It will lose a notion of what is real and what is unreal. It will become semi-psychotic or psychotic. What does this mean? There have been research papers where people were put into, what are they called? oh God, I forgot I forgot what the word is, but chambers where they couldn't hear anything, they couldn't see anything, they couldn't be affected by outside stimuli. So these isolation chambers where all of the senses were basically dampened and people were just left in silence and darkness. And they wanted to see if, when completely isolated, if people would form a greater sense of self, and they didn't. They started feeling high anxiety and disintegrating and losing touch with reality. So this is what happens to schizoid patients. Not only because they will self-isolate and they generally won't have intimate relationships, they might even get married, but not they won't have like a deep emotional contact with the people in their lives, or they might not even have any sort of contact with anyone outside of their immediate family. And because they withdraw from the outer world and they decide, I'm not going to invest in external objects, they self-isolate, and their mind, in order not to disintegrate, in order to not lose a sense of self, the mind will actually generate imaginary people so that the schizoid can interact with another person in their mind, so that the mind can keep a sense of self. Many schizoids will satisfy their need for the other person, through maladaptive daydreaming, through spending a large portion of their time having relationships in their heads or being another person in their head. A third way that schizoids will deal with their vulnerable need for attachment is through compulsions and addictions. Yeah, lots of schizoid patients have some sort of drug addiction or some other sort of compulsion. Drug addiction is an attempt to blur the boundaries between what is and isn't real. When we use drugs, when we use different substances, a different state of mind comes over us. We feel pleasure, we feel certain things that make us kind of regress and not have to act like adults that have all of these horrible problems to deal with. If you don't get love and affection, well, you know what? You can get a little high in a compulsive way from time to time. So many schizoids, they will substitute relationships with their little drug of choice, their pot, or maybe some prescription drug or some other drug that they get somehow. And this is the third way of dampening their own perception of their need for attachment. So what happens with schizoid patients, because they're already kind of detached from reality and they're off in their minds, and their mind is trying to generate fantasies so that they can keep a sense of self, is that they're very close to semi-psychotic states, in the sense that schizoid patients, when they are submitted to great stress, they might actually go full-on psychotic for a period of time. It's important during a differential diagnosis to be able to determine whether there were psychotic episodes or psychotic symptoms before the break, right? Or if the person was just schizoid and then was submitted to stress and then had like a psychotic episode. Because if there was psychosis involved with the schizoid traits, that could be a number of other things. Many personality types and personality disorders have a schizoid core. So these are just some interesting things about schizoids. There are many things about schizoids that seem to go against what the DSM-5 says, but it's just because, really, if you look at the literature, there's more information that provides greater wealth of understanding for this disorder, right? That's what I wanted to tell you guys in this video here. Oh, just one last thing. If you're a therapist or if you are a schizoid and you're doing therapy, one great way of really supporting therapy processes with schizoids is to never try to force them to restructure their personality. Schizoids are scared that if they ever have to have relationships, they're going to have to like be surrounded by people all the time and be extroverted. And it is our job as therapists to assure them that they do not need to restructure their personality and become different people. They should absolutely respect their need for solitude and space in all situations, even though they can slowly move towards having relationships with other people, even if it is in a virtual group setting. I myself have had schizoid patients that were with me in long-term group programs that happened online. And with time, after those initial months of like, no, I don't need people. No, I don't want people. I never wanted relationships. No, I don't want any of that. They were finally able to admit to themselves, wait a second, I actually decided when I was younger that I was an alien, there was no place for me in the world, and I decided to shut myself off. They were able to remember their decision, and in doing so, they were also able to reclaim their need for self-expression, for letting those affects flow, you know what I mean? Now it's safe to feel yourself and your needs. And they were able to connect with other people in the group and actually start building relationships. So yeah, schizoids can definitely move towards having healthy relationships if therapists don't force them to change their personality structure. So there's a lot more that I would love to talk about when it comes to schizoid. It's such a rich structure for us to talk about and to understand. Let me know if you want any specific information, if you like this video, if you want any questions answered. Let me know everything in the comments below.